to accept it?
This meeting is being recorded.
Okay. So let me ask everybody to mute yourself so that we don't have any unexpected interruptions. And with that, I am going to turn it over to Naomi, and I'm going to spotlight people.
Thank
Yours,
you.
Naomi.
I'm also going to add before we start that please put your questions in the chat as we are going along, and Bill and Janine will collect those questions as we go. We won't ask them during the chat, but we will address them at the end. So welcome to our climate therapy session. I hope this will be a good discussion for things that we don't normally get to talk about with each other. We all experience distress and grief and anxiety in our lives. I mean, it's part of being a living, sentient being. And those feelings can work themselves out, and we can evolve and get beyond that. But sometimes that doesn't happen. And that means we can sink into despair, and despair can be paralyzing. And when it comes to climate change, we really don't want to be paralyzed. So Marilyn, you've professionally written about this, worked on this. How does one define climate distress or climate despair?
Yeah, well, I think I was inspired actually to go into environmental work because 1973, 74 was that spring was the first Earth Day, and David was also there for the first Earth Day. And in some ways, it was a little bit of a diversion of our energy from protesting the the Vietnam War to focus on this broader issue that I was unaware of, as many people were. And so I just was drawn to environmental work, and I was drawn to Alaska because I also love wild areas and being out in nature. And that I've been involved in it politically my entire adult life. So there's always anxiety because there's always a sense that you're fighting, the destructive tendencies of our species in terms of loss of habitat for other species, that there's always anxiety around these issues, even when especially when you compromise, you often politically need to compromise, but that causes anxiety. I think I found most recently found an interesting definition of hope and despair was that, you fall into despair when you can't think of any reason to have hope that what you might fear is going to happen will actually happen. Once you can't really find a way to reason out a different future than what you fear, that's when what I personally find, you start going to these like circles of what I call rumination, in terms of you just can't get out of a downward spiral into, what's the point of it all and that sort of thing. I'm not hearing you, Naomi.
Why bother if there's no hope and you're getting beaten down? I mean, that's the definition of insanity, right?
Well, the other thing too is it's when you find, it's really, I think with climate change in particular, there's every reason to be find anxiety and kind of go in that negative direction, because the things that I love and other people love are under threat, and that what we're sort of mounting in response is so much less than we would hope in terms of the threat that's out there. So yeah, I think it's very natural to be in that state, and then to get to a point like, what can I do? That it's really easy to go there.
Right. David, you had this kind of seminal experience in the 80s at the height of the AIDS crisis, and you certainly experienced hopelessness. I mean, the situation was kind of hopeless at times, and experienced despair. How did your work in AIDS, how did you find a way to cope with that? And are any of those coping strategies applicable to finding a way out of despair and into some hope for our work in climate change?
I'm smiling a little bit because I'm remembering the very first journal entry. The first night I got back home from this unprecedented experience of being asked to take a new law and manage the primal terrors of epidemic. And I did write in my journal that night that I had assessed my assignment and concluded that I was being asked to empty the ocean with a spoon. So from that initial assessment, I tried to be as realistic as I could be. But that realism, I think, is what the three of us, as we've been in dialogue these past few weeks, we're talking about, that being realistic can lead to despair.
Well, it can also, I think, lead to hope, in that if you're realistic about what one can accomplish, then maybe you can accomplish some little things and not completely fall into despair. Or am I wrong about that?
Well, I do have to push back some because in the AIDS epidemic, people with faces were dying that we knew. To pull the camera back from that kind of dramatic pushback, I want to add that whether we're talking about AIDS or whether we're talking about the current situation, our generation, the generation that we've progenerated, we are the first of our species to have a self-awareness of total death, of totalizing our sense of the world, whether it's a nuclear image or it is death through our own ignorance, through our own evilness, through the machinery of death that the Nazis built. So unless I remind myself that I carry around inside certain terrifying images that are without precedent, I'm unable to build, as they say these days, a hopeful narrative from those low moments. And I think I'll be making that point in a number of different ways this hour, that we have to note, using a different term, the most terrifying movie that goes on in people's private heads. We have to speak to that kind of fear in order to regenerate hope.
Well, David, you and I spoke about this earlier, which was you and I were both anthropology majors, and we talked about how in our culture, we push away death. We don't want to think about it. It's not part of life. And in so many cultures, death is part of life, and death is part of life. But I think it's very hard for us to get our arms and our minds around the notion that our planet may die and that life on this planet may die. And Marilyn, I mean, what do we do about that? Because it's such a big thought and such a depressing thought that you could immediately go into despair. I mean, what do we do? Do we listen to Dylan Thomas and rage against the dying of the light, or do we back off, or is there some middle ground?
Well, I think it's true. You know, the other thing I would say about despair is also generational, in the sense that the generation that we are all in, I had what, most of my adult life, I was able to feel some sort of success in doing environmental work, that, you would either lessen the impact of certain types of development projects or preserve areas we thought as wilderness, as if they would be the same forever. And then the reality of global climate change is that everything is changing very rapidly, much more than our abilities to, reverse that. It's not reversible at this point. There's a certain amount that's happened that's pushing these ecosystems in directions that they're not going to recover from back to a former state. Hopefully, they might get to tipping points, we don't know. But I think eventually, I guess I'm going to say what it comes down to, though, is a real, not looking at it as a technological problem or a scientific problem or an educational problem. If people just understood it, they change. It's really an ethical, moral dilemma. And so, I think the self, I don't want to say satisfaction, but the hope comes from how you yourself choose to respond and how you choose to work collectively with other people to respond, to have a different future than the worst possible case. That's where I see the hope, is that you have to be realistic. I think what David's saying is absolutely correct. To be optimistic and say, oh, it's not going to happen, or as many people do, just deny that it's happening or that humans have any role in it or we could make any change. But I do think it comes down to having some really, the conversations that we have, like this one, do come down to, what kind of world do you want for the future, and what can you do to make it less grim than it could be? And so, yeah.
Yeah, no, so David, you must have had some notions like that, because in the 80s, during the height of the AIDS crisis, I think hope was very hard to find, and taking what I agree with a lot of what Marilyn says about finding what you can do. What was it that you found that you could do that gave you the ability to go on and keep fighting, which you did, and how can we learn from that in terms of finding something that we can do in terms of climate change?
Well, the strangest thing is a very clear answer to that happened for me just 2 months into 24 years of work. It was when I was, as the local government official asked to enforce a brand new AIDS civil rights law, I was asked to attend a meeting of people with AIDS in Los Angeles. And I thought I was just going to gently wave and be acknowledged. And I was asked to say a few words. And I just knew almost nothing about AIDS at that point. And I kind of punted. And I said to everybody, I hope to be learning from you about the only thing I can say right now that I can bring to this conversation is something I stumbled on while I was in law school and suffered a disorienting death in my extended family. It led me to begin to look at end-of-life decision-making. And all I shared with these folks was this simple thought, that all of us who were then in our 20s and 30s, we had grown up in a culture that not only had absolutized death the way I referenced earlier, but it had also somehow also removed dying from daily lived experience. No one died in my home. Animals were not slaughtered down at the local shopping center that I could see. And that this notion that this most fundamental truth of human living is not only this most profound mystery, but we are more disabled today from being ready for it, defying it, responding to it than ever before, because it's not something that people in wealthy countries often experience until their 30s or 40s. And the end of the story, and I don't dramatize this, just an immense crowd of the audience came up to me afterwards and said, "Thank you for saying what you said. We've been going to AIDS meetings for 2 or 3 or 4 years, and no one has said anything about death, let alone what you just said." And I not only was touched and moved beyond measure, but that gave me a touchstone for the rest of the 24 years. I've always made that point wherever I've gone, and it seems to empower frightened people that, oh, maybe some of our fear is simply because death and dying is even more unknown to us than it ever was before.
I have had this similar experience to you in my life, and of course that changed. I feel like I had a decade of death where I was dealing with nothing but death of family members for 10 years, and that taught me a lot. And Marilyn, I turn to you and say, so this is how we live, and this is our culture. And you live in a place where Alaska Native Indigenous cultures are extremely important. Oral history has carried that culture down for generations. And we know the Arctic is a bellwether for the rest of us, and glaciers are dying, things are dying there before some of us down here are seeing it. What in being in Alaska has informed you both in terms of despair and hope?
Well, that's a big question.
Well, it is, but I'm sure there's a lot to say about it.
Yeah,
So
there is. Yeah, I wanted to respond first. I mean, what David and you were both saying in terms of how our culture deals with the death of someone who is close to you, who might live in your same home. I think it's just so totally magnified out into all of the other living beings in the planet that I think part of the climate despair is if you've had experiences and formed relationships and connections to other species and places, which I have had the opportunity to do in Alaska, while there's still very little impact of humans is visible. And then to go in my lifetime to where we're in the Anthropocene, and you can't go anywhere where there isn't a greenhouse gas issue or a pollutant in the Arctic that has come from somewhere else. We've had oil spills, we've had some really major human disasters here, and then we have climate change, and I was very fortunate to spend when I was in graduate school and afterwards, there were 8 summers when I was able to go do field work in the Arctic. So I have that's my baseline of what the Arctic was like in the late 70s, early 80s. And so and I've been able then to go back for another decade to work with the educators there. We're trying to bring together the indigenous knowledge and value system with Western science in the Arctic. So that's been, that all of that kind of feeds into the watching this dramatic change. And, the people, what do you teach the children becomes one of these questions. You grow up, if you're born into the Arctic today, it's kind of unimaginable what it's going to be like 20 years from now. And it is for everyone who's living there. They have seen so much change, and it's happening. That permeates Alaska. I think how you had so much that was functioning naturally with some, human impact, and to see that change so dramatically in such a short period of time is very disorienting and disruptive. But can I say just one more thing? But that, as you mentioned, those indigenous cultures have been so resilient to so much change that they are very inspiring.
Yeah, I mean, where I lived and worked, there were 32 Native communities surrounding or in and around the park in Southwest Alaska. Of course, it was their land. We took it away from them. But I learned so much from that mix of how they live their lives, their relationship to the ecosystems and their life and the lives of the planet and all those living things. When I was first there in 2019, you will remember this, we had 10 days of 90-degree weather, and that's never happened in Alaska before, and that's pretty scary. So are there, from your experience with and knowledge from indigenous cultures or your experience in Alaska, what do you think are the little things that we can do that can give us some sense of accomplishment to give us hope to go on?
Well, it's a challenge to learn from indigenous cultures and then deal with the politics of indigenous sovereignty and cultures. But I do think there's always been a countercultural aspects of Western culture that are also holistic and relational and ecology, thinking ecologically. And I think to the extent this is not a little thing, but I think resisting our culture and looking for creative ways that people are resisting our culture to think more holistically and act more holistically in terms of what to do in response to climate change. Whether it's, it's as simple as growing your garden every year and growing as much of your food as you can and paying attention to the seasons. And, there's just so much I think you can do at community level if you think in that relational way and that ecological way. And I know that's kind of vague, but I feel like it is. But the interesting thing about indigenous knowledge is it's very local. They have such a solid knowledge of their local environment that they have sometimes been in for thousands of years. And that I think is what we are also missing oftentimes in our communities. So I feel like focusing locally and trying to build that knowledge and community and connections, not just socially, but ecologically within your own communities is really crucial.
There's yet another narrative out of AIDS that speaks to this. Anthony Fauci is retiring this month. Many people don't know that in the mid-1980s, he was Satan to a lot of AIDS activists. And they didn't take no for an answer when it came either to the design of certain research protocols or the release of certain drugs that had not been vetted the way that things are vetted in normal time. And Anthony Fauci would be the first person to tell you that he grew immensely in encountering that insistence that business as usual cannot continue. And that is something that is there, I think, for each of us, wherever we are, to be inspired by in order to take whatever our own next step is. There is no formula for resilience. It's extraordinarily particular to each person. The key to it, I think, though, is knowing that when one resists and acts, one acts within perhaps the deepest human tradition of all.
Yeah, I think that's really important. I mean, the ability to take in and to change, and also Marilyn, what you said about local. I always think that small changes lead to big changes. And before we started, we talked about some actual good climate news this week, which is the Pebble Mine project may be on the road to death. For those of you who don't know about Pebble Mine was something that was a project that we thought was dead 20 years ago, that this open pit mine to be built by a company that has had disastrous mines everywhere else. And it would be right at Bristol Bay, which has the largest sockeye salmon run in the world and is home to a huge fishing industry, as well as a very, very healthy ecosystem. And the Trump administration was very close to having it happen. And this week, the regional EPA recommended that it be killed. So it doesn't have a stake in its heart yet. But that was a lot of work from a lot of people. I mean, there were powerful people who went to Washington and testified in front of Congress. But, you know, I was working with our local Alaska Native corporations and others to fight it. And I think another element of that, and you mentioned this, David, is finding something you love on this earth and in your environment on this earth gives you something to fight for. And I think can spur you through some aspects of despair. Bill mentioned Fat Bear Week, and for those of you who don't know what Fat Bear Week is, it's March Madness for fat bears, and we create a bracket for the fat bears at the Brooks River in Katmai National Park in Alaska, and which has the highest concentration of brown bears in the world. And the year before I started there, 55,000 people voted in this event. Last year, over 1 million people voted. And it's a fun social media event, but I call it a cheap trick to a higher purpose. And the purpose is to let the world know that there exists in this 1.5 mile river a really healthy ecosystem with a lot of interconnected life. And when you know about that and you get a connection to that and you love that, then you will start acting upon it. And I think, to get to Marilyn's point, you know, have a garden in your backyard or in a community garden, or those local things that you can do. And I'm not talking about carbon offsets and things like that, but really connecting to your part of the earth and the things that you value. And I think that, you know, I think that's analogous to what happened in AIDS. People became more connected. Is that right, David?
It is. I was going to offer a slightly different angle that nonetheless picks up on your last point. It may be temperament, it may be the fact that I live in the tiny village of Los Angeles, California, but finding my local glacier has always been extremely hard to do, and it's one of the ways I've had to resist for the last 45 years of living here. But I want to talk about interpersonal inspiration in a very personal way for a moment. Marilyn and I, who knew each other over our freshman year, that spring was when students were murdered by official authorities at Kent State and at Jackson State. And I got back home. I come from a close, large, noisy Jewish family. And my best friend, kind of the fifth son, was joining us one Friday night. And he was talking about the way that the police had been dragging people off of patios in Isla Vista, where he went to school at UC Santa Barbara. And my dad, a wonderful, greatest generation World War II vet kind of guy, went into a very understandable, well, Doug, I'm not sure. Did you see that yourself? Or maybe I find it very hard to believe that police. And from the other side of the table, I heard my mother's mother, whose voice was like a song, say, you know, I don't have trouble believing Doug. I remember in 1905, during the attempted revolution, that Tsar's police would beat up the students, and oh, it was awful. Well, I just was flabbergasted because it was the first political thing I'd ever heard Grandma say. And it knocked any self-pity out of me for the rest of my life. It's too easy to say, oh, our immigrant grandparents, they had it tough. No, she saw something like I had been traumatized by, and she did a lot more than just move on. She was there to tell the story 65 years later. And so those stories, our human culture is rich with those stories, and Netflix is now rich with those stories. So I think we're going to find emotional, existential sustenance in all kinds of ways, from the natural world and from the social world. I think that is ramping up, and I think that will feed us all. And we will feed more people that way, even with something as bizarre as Zoom. I mean, this is even better than flying cars in the Jetsons. I mean, I'm at home and I'm talking to you guys.
Marilyn, I mean, those are great comments, and I am a big advocate of intergenerational storytelling. I had a UPIC intern in my first year at Katmai, and he would tell me stories that had been passed down to him by his elders and myths. And I used to have him, he would come to my evening programs every week and tell those stories to the visitors. And I told him his assignment was to figure out why bears hate ravens, because I figured there had to be a UPIC myth somewhere that told that story. But I think you're right. I mean, making those connections, and the connections that we need to make to future, to current young generations, Gen Z and future generations. Marilyn, at this point, I'm going to ask you to tell us about your book, and then I think we should go to questions from people who are in the Zoom.
Okay, well,
We haven't said the title of your book yet.
Yeah, the book is Entangled People and Ecological Change in Alaska's Kachemak Bay. And I actually changed my life to work on climate change education and work with climate scientists, anyway, quite a few years ago. And I got really frustrated though, because I finally got it that even telling science in a very engaging way wasn't really changing people's beliefs in climate change, those that did not believe in it. And I myself had this ongoing angst about this, there's a sadness attached to the loss of places and certain, the environment that you love and places that you love. And so I started writing creatively about that. And I got this crazy idea that I would do that for the whole 8,000 year period that people lived in Kachemak Bay, which I regretted many times as I was in the process of writing it. But I think what it did is it gave me an incredible perspective on how it is true that climate is always changing. This place I live, the southern rim of Alaska, is really dynamic with volcanoes and earthquakes. And the really impressive thing, and when you tell that story and you lay it out there as factually as you can, and it extends back into what the indigenous people say is time immemorial in their stories, there's such a disruption and break only 300 years ago, when the European powers showed up. And to see what has happened in those 300 years is just, really interesting. I mean, it's almost mind blowing. And I knew it, in some ways, but just laying it out there really gave me this perspective. So it gave me a perspective, I think, on my own life and where my own lifetime sits. We talked about these shifting baselines. We only have our lifetime to what we can gauge things by from what we experience, but then this much longer ecological time frame, which helps me think about what's happening now in I think a more, maybe a less emotional way, because I can put that all in perspective. And it also did connect me back into these, like we mentioned earlier, the indigenous worldview is much more resilient than the one we were engaged in. And so it kept challenging me to think creatively and think, in a different way. And that's why I say that's where my hope lies, is those cultures have sustained themselves with incredible stress and trauma and diversity. And what they have chosen to bring forward is what is, I think, is a very resilient, way of life. And, I think there are things happening in our culture right now which dovetail with that pretty closely if we can raise those up above our dominant worldview, which is so destructive. So that was the breadth of the book, was this whole 8,000 year kind of history and reflecting on what that meant in terms of climate change, and then kind of my own grief process to work through. One of the things I did in the book, and I would recommend this to everyone, is when you're feeling this sense of loss of places or things that you experienced earlier in your life, it's great. I mean, let yourself wallow in nostalgia. Nostalgia is actually good for you. The psychologists say so. It's when you cling to that and say you want it to happen again, like you want maybe a certain nation to be supreme because it was in some golden past. That's a bad thing. But this nostalgia for things that you so loved and enjoyed, even though you have this sense it's not going to come back, you can't make it come back, is really positive. So that you re-experience that joy that you had, in places that you love. That writing creatively, doing anything creatively, I think, is a way to rekindle that joy and then use that as your motivation for activism.
Thank you. I highly recommend Marilyn's book. If you want some sense of resiliency and hope, I think her book will give that to you. Bill and Janine, do you want to come and join us and tell us what questions we have from people in this Zoom?
Yeah, people have been, I think, paying close attention to the discussions, and we've really only had one question put up so far. However, I think it certainly for me, it's paying attention to the discussions and such. I just wanted to mention one thing as your sort of closing comments that I thought was very, very interesting, and it's the telling of stories. And each of you talk about the personal stories and how powerful those are. And Naomi, that is your background. And we've got a number of other people that have that same sort of background. And as a scientist, I try to deal with facts, and those are can vary a lot. But to capture the stories, to then convey to other people how they have a sense of place and a sense of what's going on and empowerment, I think that's critically important. So thank you.
Well, I'm going to add one thing to that, Bill, which is also it saves us. There's one story that I always like to tell, which was there was a fishing village not far on the Saganowski River that was not far from where I lived. And in early 19th century, there was the largest volcanic eruption. Early 20th century, there was the largest volcanic eruption ever at Nova Rupta. And one of the elders in this fishing village said, everyone turn over your boats and get as much water as you can, because there will be no more water. And then they got the water, they got in their boats, and they went out into the bay, and they were picked up by a very large fishing vessel. Now, that was knowledge gained from stories told from elders over generations who had experienced volcanic eruptions before. And had those stories not been told, those people would have died. So it would, to me, that was just a very poignant example of how important it is to tell these stories and pass on these knowledge and tell the joy of the garden in your, New York neighborhood.
In addition, even the English language has something to teach us. For some reason, very early on in my AIDS work, what I'm about to share kind of broke through and has never left me. It turns out that an archaic use of the word to remember, the verb to remember, the word remember, is as the antonym of dismember. To remember is also to take the broken pieces and bring them back together into maybe a new kind of whole, but back into a whole. I do not know, even to this day, why that sustains me so much. I'm on the other end of what Marilyn has done. I'm trying to creatively write something like my narrative. It's hard, but it is somehow profoundly human, and this mass depersonalizing culture we Euro-Americans have manufactured, it can't last in its current fashion. We all know that. And at the same time, something new is going on, and we're all involved in trying to remember what that is.
So Bill, there was one question.
We've now got three. Let me start off, and David, this is toward you. Mark McLeod asked, how did Dr. Fauci respond to the pressure from the AIDS sufferers and activists? Did he stick to the traditional clinical trial protocols, or did he move to another position?
He was extraordinary. The guy who organized ACT UP was a loudmouth Jew from New York named Larry Kramer, and I use those descriptors because he would use them himself. And Fauci invited Kramer and his inner circle to his home, and they broke bread. And that process for Fauci did what all of us in the early years of AIDS kind of knew was what changed behavior. That experience gave him the AIDS with a face, not a bunch of patients that he was treating, with that doctor screen between him and his patients when he was working clinically, but as peers, as friends, as adversaries. And that so broke through his siloing that came from his training, that made him a master at what he did as a researcher, as an administrator, that it enabled him to reimagine in partnership with these folks, dual track clinical trials, making compassionate use release for a lot of the drugs that were on back shelves of pharmaceuticals that were not being thrown at the problem. So he would say it changed his life, and it changed protocols, Mark. It changed protocols distinctly at the FDA and at NIH.
I wonder, I love that thought of breaking bread in that way with those who are protesting what you're doing? I would love to think more deeply about that and how we could do that in environmental activism. I mean, Bill, do you have thoughts about that?
Yeah, that's a very good point, because there are sort of a forming and changing and reimagining of different groups that are coming together or splitting apart. I say that because there are people, I'm very deeply involved in offshore wind here in Oregon for a variety of reasons. And there are advocates against offshore wind here, but it seems to be very strongly rooted in a very local opposition to something that they don't want a disruption of their environment, because you see the same sort of local opposition to something that globally has to happen. And so trying to get together and talk to people and see each other not as opponents, but as other people, when we have somewhere between 80 and 99% in common, especially a love of the environment, a love of our children, a love of what we value deeply, and trying to change it from opponents to other people. So I think that there's a lot to your story, David, that really rings.
Next
Let me
question.
jump on to the next question, and this is Marilyn for you. And Michael Connor asked, in all the years of your training kids in Homer, what strategies work best?
Well, I'd like to say I was involved with kids of all ages because I think I came to kind of the environmental education field after working in research and habitat management and some of the policy areas. And I think that the model that they have is so effective that you start with awareness and experience, because people can't argue against their experience. You know, it's the experience that first grabs people, that then is true to them, not the knowledge. And so you move from the awareness to the knowledge, to these attitudes, to the sense of connections that people do experience. And that's what finally leads into some sort of, environmental action or political action, or how you're it's like the attitudes in action. And so I just feel like that was always really successful, as long as you do that at every age. So it doesn't mean that, if you've got first graders out there, they're only doing experience. They're obviously spending a lot more time doing experience, but at the earliest ages, you can start having them think, helping them think, guide them into thinking, for themselves about, what are the implications of what you've just observed or what you're experiencing. So I think it's this whole process of going, building the attitudes and the connections to the natural world, from the bottom up. And I think going back to breaking, so maybe some of those people that are you can get people with very different political attitudes out into some kind of field trip or experience, and that opens some doors that would not be opened if you just said, let me tell you what the science says, so you should be concerned about climate change. That those people will turn you off immediately. So I think starting with some sort of shared experience is a really good way to go.
Agree with that. Let me continue on so we can get a couple of other questions in here. Bill Madrill his comment was, thanks so much for sharing your wisdom. I think despair and hope are often mentioned together. I have found that a daily gratitude practice is stronger than the up and down of hope. Could gratitude or other practices be more helpful for some people? Let you pick out who to address that.
I'll jump in for a moment. I was trained to recite Jewish blessings of gratitude when I got up in the morning, when I went to bed at night. I was supposed to do one before every meal. The fact that I don't do that religiously is irrelevant. It's how I was trained. Patterns of being aware. We're not discovering those for the first time. We might be getting brain studies, MRIs of them, but the distinction between knowledge and understanding goes back to the beginning of our species as well. And we all have traditions. They may be fragmented traditions. They may be broken traditions. They may be traditions we need to create out of pieces. But ritual behavior is there because it is how humans remind ourselves of important things. That's why we remember. So I find ritual in the broadest sense to be linked for me with gratitude.
I will also add that I agree that gratitude is really important. And if you're grateful for something, you'll defend it.
But I would just add that I just, I agree with everything you're saying, and I find, just going for a walk every day resets me, and you can show that in the brain waves. But you just resets that thermometer of going down into some sort of spiral with not being unaware that we have issues in the world. And the other piece of it is humility. I mean, I think that the more you observe, pay attention to the world and how much is still out there and resilient and beautiful to you, just is humbling, So it also, I think those two things, a daily practice of not only gratitude, but humility.
I do have one book recommendation. It's real old. No, I'm not going to say the Bible. Viktor Frankl's Man's Search for Meaning. I read it that first year at college. It had already been out for 20 years. It is a perennial bestseller. The gender language is what it is. When Viktor Frankl, a Holocaust survivor and Viennese trained psychiatrist, when he wrote it, that's what he wrote. But it is as rich and simple and compelling a narrative about renewal and making meaning out of life and out of death that I know. Doesn't mean I read it every year, but if one has never read it and you're looking around, Viktor Frankl, Frankl, Man's Search for Meaning.
All right. We have some little more just comments and such, but I think we've gotten to pretty last couple of minutes. So Naomi, if you want to kind of figure a way of wrapping things up, you're mute at the moment.
Yes, I unmuted.
There we go.
Thank you.
Yep.
Well, I think that I hope that this brings some hope and stimulates people to think about what is in their own backyard. And I don't mean that literally, but figuratively as well. I mean, I lived in New York City for most of my life, and resilience to climate change is important there too. And the importance of every little park in that place is so meaningful. So it's not just the grand places like Alaska that give us inspiration to get through our despair, to keep doing something, whatever we can, to stop to stop our destruction of this planet. And so I'm just going to leave and just say, this has been a really wonderful discussion to begin future discussions. And I hope that you all have suggestions of other things that we can talk about. Marilyn or David, do you have any closing thoughts?
I'll jump in just to acknowledge and be grateful for the fact that I could meet somebody in Wilbur Hall's food service area. I was living in an all-male freshman dorm. I hated having to be in an all-male freshman dorm. And Marilyn Sigmund was in the all-female fresh women's dorm right next to me. And we started chatting, lost touch for decades. It's pretty amazing to have picked this conversation back up, Marilyn, in the last 8 or 10 weeks. I couldn't be more grateful that you did that for me.
Well, I'll just say too, that I think that that's one of the things that we are hungry for in our culture, is these meaningful conversations. This has been one of them. And I feel like when I started writing in a disciplined way, I didn't anticipate this. I did go back to get, to school to learn how to write well. But I think that finding communities who are thinking seriously about climate change and willing to have these kinds of conversations is really crucial, because it's real easy to get isolated. I think the COVID epidemic certainly created a lot of isolation for people. So, but I felt like, and I'd urge everybody to really lean into your most creative part of yourself, because that's what's going to take, to get through this. And find those other people who are being really creative about this and are willing to have these serious conversations. It's if you think about trying to convert 49 or whatever it is % of the United States voters, it's not going to happen in time. So it's like, how do you find the kindred souls, the like-minded people, the creative people, right in your, like you said, in your community, in your neighborhood, online. I think that's going to provide that sense of community and collective responsibility as we move forward.
All right. Well, at that, since my clock says 5:01, my time, I'm gonna do what I do way too often, which is cut off some very interesting discussions. But what I would like to do is I wanted to thank Marilyn and David and Naomi, and many people in the chat have done the same thing. I also want to thank everybody that was listening in on this and providing questions and comments and that sort of thing. Everybody, including the speakers and anybody that's still online, I would please ask of you to send me ideas for additional types of speakers to have, topics to discuss. I think to be an instigator for these sorts of discussions is valuable, and to have somebody like Naomi that has been very good at leveraging her experience to get people to have these good conversations. And you don't, in the audience, you don't recognize just how much work she did to prepare Marilyn and David to work through all of the different things. And it's been great. So please help us out to the extent that we can continue to have more of these. This is through the Stanford Alumni for Climate Action, but it is open to everybody because we're all in this together. So with that, I'm going to turn off the recording and say thank you very much for everybody that's attended. I will have the recording posted, send it out, links to people as soon as we can get it set up. So with that, thank you. Have a very good evening.
Thank you, Bill, so much.
Bye-bye.
And thank everybody.
Thank you all. Bye-bye.